Paul McCartney started creating the bass line for the final Beatles song in 1995, but didn't finish it until 2022. That is 27 years it took to craft this bass line. And the result? Utter genius. But it's not a masterpiece just for the notes he plays or the rhythms that he uses. The real reason it's so good goes way, way deeper than that. But to understand why this bass line took 27 years to write, you need to know the story of how this song almost didn't happen and why Paul had serious doubts about whether they should even be making this song at all. In the years before John Lennon was tragically assassinated, he had made a bunch of demos of new original songs. But with his death, it seemed like his final tracks might never see the light of day. Years later though, Yoko Ono, who had the tapes, gave them to the remaining Beatles. They managed to resurrect 2 brand new Beatles songs using John's voice from the demos. However, there was a third song, but that one was tricky. Lennon's voice was too scrambled in with the piano, which made it impossible to mix. And despite their best efforts at the time, they had to abandon the song entirely, unfinished and unheard. However, fast forward to 2022, and with some massive advances in recording technology, untangling Lennon's voice from the piano suddenly became doable, and the impossible seemed possible. But then they came face to face with a huge moral dilemma. Even though they had the guitar tracks that George Harrison had recorded from the abandoned 1995 session, George himself had also passed away in 2001. So Paul wondered whether finishing this lost Lennon song was even the right thing to do without John or George.
Is it something we shouldn't do?
But when Paul thought about whether John would have wanted the remaining Beatles to finish this song, he thought,
yeah, he would have loved that.
So with the decision made, they went full steam ahead with the project, and the very first thing that Paul wanted to work on? The bass line. Why? Because listening back to the 1995 recordings, he said this.
Oh, I could actually do the bass a bit better, so why don't I start there?
What I wouldn't give to hear the 1995 version of this bass line, just to hear the difference between that and the 2022 recording. Just to know what counts as not good enough for a Paul McCartney bass line. But the bass line we did get was one of the Beatliest bass lines of all time, and to my ears, there are 3 key things that jump out at me. See if you can spot the first of the massive hallmarks of Paul's playing from the very first note that he plays. There's one really key thing here that really stands out to me. You see, Paul, along with a handful of other bassists in the 60s, completely changed how the electric bass was approached. Before Paul and these handful of innovators, the electric bass in pop music was almost always relegated to very simple, very functional bass lines. Lots of root notes, and not much else. Paul started to do things differently though, and he never stopped. Instead of just playing roots over and over, the key thing he started adding was more melody to his playing, more melodic ideas that went beyond just being exclusively supportive. But Paul goes a step further than simply being melodic. He actually becomes counter-melodic. And that's exactly what happened in that first example.
And now and then, if we must start again.
It's like this really playful conversation between the voice and the bass. Plus, it is a great phrase that balances the melody really, really well. John's phrase starts a bit higher and ends a little lower, so to counter that, Paul's phrase starts a little bit lower and ends a little bit higher. There's a really beautiful balance there. Now, Paul uses this idea of counter melody all over this track, but the result, and possibly the problem of Paul being super conversational and counter melodic like this through the whole song, means that in parts, the bass line does get pretty busy, like this phrase from the second chorus. Or this phrase from the third verse. But even though Paul is playing a lot of notes here, there's something this bass line doesn't do. Now, when I listened to this song the first few times, I wasn't really paying that much attention to the bass specifically. I was just kind of listening as a whole to the song. But when I really focused in on the bass line, I was really surprised. I was like, damn, there is a lot going on here, and I hadn't even consciously noticed. And that's the second key thing about this bass line. Even though it is quite busy in parts, it's just so well thought out that the one thing this bass line doesn't ever do is get in the way or pull focus from Lennon's melody or his lyrics. Paul uses a few tricks of musical sleight of hand to pull this off. See if you can figure out some of the more important ones by watching me do the wrong thing right now. And now here's Paul's actual isolated bass track. Can you hear the difference? I was playing the exact same notes and the exact same rhythms, but it sounds way different, right? The way that Paul plays it is so important. He does some very subtle palm muting with his plucking hand like this. Instead of having his hand kind of up and out, playing like that, he actually puts his palm onto the strings ever so gently and plays a little bit like that. Gives this super warm and thumpy sound. And that's how he gets away with it. That's how he can play lots of notes and never feel like he's stealing the spotlight. It is the tone he uses. The tone is just as important as the notes he plays and the rhythms that he uses. But even with Paul's subtle tone trick, for some people, this bass line may still feel a little bit too busy. In fact, there's even a history of tension within the Beatles about Paul's lines getting too busy, specifically with George Harrison. There's a very famous story of when they were recording George's song Something, and George was apparently very insistent about telling Paul that he needed to simplify what he was playing. And what's really interesting about that is what Paul does for the bass line during the slide guitar solo, the place where George would have had the spotlight. In fact, the only place Paul goes more than half a dozen bars without adding in a bit of kind of busy counter melody is in the slide guitar solo in the bridge. The line here is busy, but nothing here is kind of in ultra counter melody mode, which makes sense. There's a lot of other stuff going on in this section. So what does Paul do when he's playing the bass part? He slips into a more of a supporting role. But what makes this pull at the heartstrings even more is that it's actually Paul playing that slide guitar solo in George's style as a tribute to his old friend. Now, it seems to me that Paul cared deeply about respecting George's taste when coming up for the bass line for the slide guitar solo. But he didn't just care about that. It seems like Paul cared so deeply and poured his heart and soul into not only the bass line, but everything. Just look at all the things he did on the recording. He played the piano part, the slide guitar solo, the percussion, shakers, added vocals and lyrics when they were missing from the Lennon demo. He commissioned the strings, and I'm guessing the entire bridge section was Paul's idea. And on top of that, he was also involved heavily in the mixing and post-production. Hell, he's even listed as a chief producer on this song, and that is the only time Paul has ever been credited that way on a Beatles tune. But why did he care so much about doing all this? Well, Giles Martin, who arranged the strings on the track, said this.
People go, oh, is this the right, what's the motivation behind this? Motivation with Paul really wanting to do something with John.
And that is the third thing about this bass line. To Paul, this song isn't just another song. And this bass line is not just another bass line. Every rhythm, every phrase, the entire arrangement, even the tone of the bass, it's meticulously crafted, spanning across 27 years in order to bridge the past and the present, allowing Paul and Ringo to reunite with their old bandmates for one final performance. When you think about Paul's bass line, where he's answering John's vocal with fills of his own, it's like he's having a conversation through time and space with his closest songwriting partner and his old friend. a conversation they can no longer have in person. I am so glad this song exists. Not just because we get one final Beatles bass line, but also because Paul bookends the Beatles' entire career in an incredibly poetic way. Because the very first thing we hear in the Beatles catalogue is Paul counting off "I Saw Her Standing There." 1, 2, 3, 4! And the very last thing we'll ever hear on any Beatles recording is Paul playing this. He's not just playing a lick here. He's not just ending the song. He's putting the final period on the final chapter of the Beatles story in a way that only he could. Now, Paul is easily one of the most influential bassists of all time, but to really understand how Paul got to where he is, you really need to know where he came from, because he didn't always play this melodically and conversationally. In fact, in this video, you'll see how I learned 227 Beatles bass lines and uncovered a massive turning point in Paul's playing, where he went from being comparatively boring with his bass lines to just downright amazing. So if you really want to understand what makes Paul as amazing as he is, I'll see you in there.